Hello and welcome. There have been more protests in cities in Israel, even though the Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has postponed his controversial reforms to the judicial system. In unprecedented events, the country's biggest trade union called a strike and Israelis watched society close down around them on Monday. Our reporter Sofia Batitza has more details.
Israel is gripped by one of the worst political crises in its history. There's outrage about a reform that would allow ministers to choose Supreme Court judges and would limit the court's powers. And after 3 months of protests, on Monday, Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu decided to halt his plan. In a TV address, he accused extremists of trying to divide the nation.
Out of national responsibility, I have decided to suspend the second and third readings of the law. There is one thing that I cannot accept. There is an extremist minority that is prepared to tear our country to pieces. It is using violence and incitement. It is talking civil war.
The US, a key ally of Israel, welcomed the move.
Compromise is precisely what we have been calling for. And we continue to strongly urge Israeli leaders to find a compromise as soon as possible.
But will this be enough? Shortly after the announcement, a planned nationwide strike was called off. The delay will buy time for Mr. Netanyahu, but it's not going to solve the problem. Demonstrators want this bill to be scrapped, not delayed. And that's why last night, tens of thousands of people again took to the streets.
It's not a victory at all. This struggle will have to continue. It's pure lies, as usual. He's just taking a break in order to come back stronger.
Police used stun grenades and mortar cannons to disperse protesters in Tel Aviv. But there are people in Israel who support Netanyahu's reform. They were protesting last night too.
It's time for a change. The people elected this government, and we want this government to elect the Supreme Court, and not for the court to elect itself. This is how democracy works.
The legislation will now be considered further in the next session of Parliament at the end of April. And Netanyahu is walking a tightrope. His coalition includes right-wing, nationalist and ultra-Orthodox parties. He depends on them to remain in power. And they've insisted that the reform must be passed at all costs. So the government is unlikely to back down. Sofia Batitza, BBC News.
Well, Guy Ziv is a professor at American University and author of works on Israeli policymaking. He told me more about how the situation became so intense so quickly.
Netanyahu really underestimated the determination and the resilience shown by these demonstrators, hundreds of thousands of them, who took to the streets week after week in defense of their democracy. Many of them are concerned that under Netanyahu's watch, Israel has been steadily moving in an increasingly illiberal direction, becoming a sort of Middle Eastern version of Hungary or Poland. And his decision to sack his defense minister, a member of his own party who simply demanded a freeze in the legislation for national security reasons, crossed a red line and only served to reinforce the perception that Netanyahu has become this sort of authoritarian leader who's putting his political and his personal interests ahead of national security interests. And this was a decision that sparked spontaneous massive protests that very night. As many as 100,000 people left their homes in the middle of the weeknight to express their outrage.
Benjamin Netanyahu argues that these judicial reforms are long needed and that people voted for them. They are a democratically elected government. Does that argument hold any sway in your view?
Well, I think this is the view of a lot of the supporters of these so-called legal reforms, which opponents see as kind of a coup. And from Netanyahu's perspective and the perspective of the supporters, they have a kind of a majoritarian view of democracy. And so as far as they're concerned, it's the elected officials, not the unelected institutions, that should make the decisions. And so for that reason, Netanyahu and his coalition partners have tried to really gut the court, weaken it to the point where it would no longer really serve as a check on the politicians.
So Netanyahu has now given himself a month's breathing space, but still says he's determined to push this through. Where could this go if the demonstrations continue as they have done, and they're just growing and growing in strength and number, but he has to appease his coalition partners? Where do you see this going?
That's right. So it's important to keep in mind that the government is delaying, not canceling, its legal overhaul agenda. So he's agreed to suspend the legislation for a month, but he's also made it clear that he has every intention to see it through. But it's also important to note that the political momentum right now is with the demonstrators, not with the government. There were 2 surveys that were published today reflecting this trend, both showing a dramatic drop in support for Netanyahu and his religious right bloc. And if elections were held today, the opposition would win enough seats to form an alternative government.